That morning, Liberty packed the courthouse steps and the auctioneer held up a deed like it was cursed. 12 acres and a cabin starting at 12 cents and nobody lifted a finger. Gideon Hale raised his hand anyway and the room answered with pity instead of envy. He rode out on a rutted trail telling himself cheap wood was still wood and a man could start over. At the gate, the grass stood tall and something taller hung from the beam, turning slow in the wind. It was a giant Apache girl, broad-shouldered, boots, missing neck, raw eyes cracked open and angry. Gideon cut the rope and her weight hit the dirt like a fallen log, still breathing. She rasped one word danger and far back in the timber. A rider watched without riding closer. If you ride with me, subscribe now, and we will open that door together. Friend, did you drink your water today? Gideon caught her shoulder and head, but he still sank to one knee because she was built like a ranch hand. He laid her in the shade of the gate and tore a strip from his shirt to wrap the rope burn. Her throat worked and he dripped canteen water onto her lips slow because too much could steal what little strength remained. When her eyes focused, they didn't look grateful. They looked hunted, and that told Gideon more than any prayer. He dragged her through the yard and into the cabin, pushing the door shut against the wind and the silence. The place wasn't dead at all. The stove held cold ash, the floor was solid, and boards covered the windows from the inside. A cabin that cheap had been avoided on purpose, and Gideon felt the town stare riding on his back. He cleared a table, set a blanket down, and eased her onto it, careful with her neck. She tried to sit up, muscles jumping under bruised skin, and Gideon pressed her back with an open palm. "Don't fight me," he said. "I'm not your captor, and I'm not your buyer." She answered in Apache first, then forced broken English. "You cut me down, they'll return." Gideon nodded like he'd already guessed it, and he set his Winchester on a chair within reach, not aimed at her. He lit the lamp, and the light showed her size, taller than him, even seated, and strong enough to scare foolish men. Gideon had heard a trading post tale about White Hawk's granddaughter, and he finally understood why the story sounded afraid. He checked her wrists, found cuts where the rope had rubbed, and washed them with water and a pinch of salt. She winced, but didn't cry, and Gideon respected that kind of pride because it kept people alive out here. Outside, a branch snapped, then another, and Gideon stepped to the porch, watching the tree line through a slit in the boards. A man in a silver-trimmed hat stood at the edge of the woods, still as a fence post, just looking. When Gideon stared back, the rider turned and slid into the trees like he owned the shadows. Gideon shut the door, barred it, and said to the girl, "That's your danger, and it just became mine." She swallowed, then said her name was Naley, and her voice carried hate for the men who used her as a sign. Gideon set more wood in the stove, and the first heat crept into the room, making the cabin feel less like a grave. Naley's eyes tracked the floor, and she whispered that a man named Hartwell died here after finding papers that proved the land was stolen. She said the men who hung her believed those papers were hidden under these boards, and they'd hang anyone who lifted them. Gideon looked at his thin herd outside, then at her bruised throat, and he knew 12 cents had bought him a war. He sat by her rifle close and said, "We'll see morning, and nobody hangs at this gate again ever here." Morning came thin and gray, and Gideon woke to Naley coughing like smoke stuck in her chest. He kept the lamp low because bright light made her squint, and he didn't want her thinking he was studying her. He boiled water on the stove, added a pinch of salt, and cleaned the rope burn again until the skin looked less angry. Naley watched his hands, then whispered, "Fletcher Knox," and Gideon felt that name land heavy like a stone in a boot. She told him the silver hat man wasn't the boss, he was the messenger. The kind that smiles while the real knives stay hidden. Gideon poured coffee for himself, then set warm water by her lips because she needed strength more than talk right now. Outside, his scrawny cattle bawled and the sound steadied him, reminding him he still had work worth doing. He walked the yard slow, found fresh hoof marks near the gate, and saw where someone had paused to look at the blood stain. Gideon dragged a broken plank across the tracks, hoping to blur the trail because he wasn't ready for visitors. Back inside, Naley tried to stand, and the table groaned, but she held herself up with pure, stubborn grit. Gideon offered his arm, and she refused at first, then took it as if accepting help was another kind of surrender. She pointed to a square of floorboards near the stove, darker than the rest, and said, "Hartwell sealed something underneath." Gideon knelt and pressed his palm there, feeling a tacky resin line, and he understood why the town would not bid. He wanted to pry it up, but he didn't, because rushing could kill them, and patience was the only tool he trusted. Naley said the papers proved judges and traders stole Apache ground, and they used this cabin as a grave for truth. Gideon's jaw clenched because he'd been cheated on cattle counts before, but this was theft with a badge on it. He told her, I bought this place fair, and I won't hand you back, not to any man, not for any price. Naley stared at him, and the fury in her eyes softened into something like disbelief, like she'd never heard a man mean it. Late that afternoon, Gideon rode to the well-filled 2 buckets and kept his head on a swivel the whole time. A crow landed on the fence cawed once, and Gideon took it as a warning because birds see what men miss. When he returned, Naley was sitting up, blanket around her shoulders, and she said, "They'll come tonight with fire." Gideon checked his Winchester, counted shells, then placed it down calm but ready still. He barred the door and told her, "This cabin won't be your noose again." Outside, the woods went quiet, and Gideon listened. Knowing Liberty's silence had teeth too, that night the stove popped low, and Gideon sat at the table with his coffee gone cold, listening to the boards breathe. Naley lay on the bed, blanket pulled up to her chin, but her eyes stayed open, watching the dark like it owed her. Gideon didn't ask her to sleep because sleep is a command, and she'd had enough commands for one lifetime. Instead, he said, quiet, "Tell me what you know about Hartwell." And he kept his gaze on the lamp flame. Naley swallowed, then spoke in broken English, naming a white man who kept ledgers and hated what he found. She said Hartwell learned the land papers were forged and that the cabin held proof meant to burn men in town. Gideon felt his stomach turn because Liberty's courthouse wasn't stone, it was a mask, and he'd seen masks before. Naley told him the men took her from a trading road, then hung her at the gate as a sign for Whitehawk. Sign that said, "Give up ground or we take blood," and Gideon's hands curled around the cup until it creaked. He asked why they didn't just kill her, and Naley answered, because living fear travels farther than death out here. Outside, an owl called, then stopped, and Gideon caught the faint rhythm of hooves. Slow and careful, testing distance. He eased to the window slit and saw a torchlight blink once between trees, then vanish like a wink. Gideon didn't fire because firing at shadows makes a man look guilty, and guilt was exactly what they wanted. He came back, set the rifle within reach, and said, "If they come talking, we don't open up for talk." Naley nodded, then surprised him, asking, "Why you bid when all town's scared?" and her voice held real curiosity. Gideon shrugged and said, "I've been poor so long, fear stopped working on me, and 12 cents sounded like mercy." Naley studied him, then said, "Mercy brings wolves," and Gideon answered, "Then we learned to hold the line." Near midnight, a knock came soft as courtesy, and Gideon's spine went tight because courtesy at this cabin meant trouble. A voice called through the door, "Smooth Gideon Hale, we can make this easy for you." And Gideon knew that tone. It was Fletcher Knox, silver hat man, sounding like a banker. Buying a soul, not a gunman, stealing a life. Gideon didn't open. He answered through the boards, "Go back to Liberty, Fletcher. I'm not selling what I bought." Fletcher chuckled and said he'd brought $500 again and 500 reasons Gideon shouldn't be stubborn tonight. Naley shifted on the bed, muscles tensing, but Gideon raised a palm, keeping her behind him without touching her. He told Fletcher, "Money don't wash blood off that beam," and the silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut. Then Fletcher's voice cooled and he said, "It ain't the cabin I want, it's what's under the floor plane." Gideon's eyes flicked to the dark resin patch, and Naley's breath hitched because the trap finally showed its teeth. Fletcher added, "Hand it over and you wake up alive," and Gideon replied, "We wake up alive anyway, or you pay." A horse snorted close, and Gideon heard men shifting in the yard, circling like they'd done this before. Naley whispered one word, "Fire," and Gideon smelled oil on the wind and knew they planned to burn secrets out. He slid the rifle into his shoulder, still not shooting, and said to Naley, "Stay low and trust my timing." Outside, Fletcher struck a match, and the tiny sound carried because some nights the whole world listens for sin. The match flared, and Fletcher's grin showed in the lantern glow like he'd already priced Gideon's funeral tonight out here. A torch sailed onto the porch roof, and dry shingles caught fast, sending bitter smoke through every crack at once. Gideon shoved the table sideways and braced it by the door, turning furniture into law for poor men right now. Naley rolled from the bed and crawled low, her huge frame moving careful, despite pain biting her neck so hard. Outside boots scraped the steps and a man laughed, believing fire would make truth crawl up screaming for them all. Gideon fired one warning shot into the dirt, and the yard went still, like even coyotes held breath just then. Fletcher called polite as church and promised Gideon safe passage if he surrendered the floor stash quietly to him now. Gideon answered through smoke and said, "You can't buy what you didn't earn, not with blood money, ever again, sir." A bullet punched the wall and splinters snapped past Gideon's cheek, reminding him this was no courthouse game at all. He dropped to a knee and slid the Winchester up, aiming at shadows, not faces, because mercy still mattered here. Naley grabbed the water bucket and dumped it on the roof edge, fighting flames like a soldier without orders today. Her hands shook, and she hissed in Apache, then met Gideon's eyes, asking if he'd stand firm with her now. Gideon nodded once, and the gesture felt heavier than vows, because he'd never planned to die for strangers out here. Fletcher's men split wide, and two circled the back wall, searching for a weak board to pry open real quick. Gideon tossed a blanket over Naley's shoulders and whispered, "Stay down, your height makes you a target in their eyes." She whispered back, "I'm not hiding again," and Gideon said, "Bravery's smart when it lives past sunrise for both us." Another torch struck the porch rail and fire climbed, but Naley smothered it with dirt. Jaws clenched tight this time. In the smoke, Gideon smelled lamp oil and understood they meant to burn the cabin into confession by force alone. He kicked the door open a crack and shouted, "Liberty's watching you even if they pretend not to right now." Fletcher's laugh turned thin and he ordered his men forward, then a distant horn rolled across grass from the east. Every rider paused and Gideon heard it too low and deep like a warning meant for wolves at nightfall. Naley's eyes widened and she murmured, "My people," and Gideon felt hope rise cautious and stubborn in his chest again. Fletcher cursed under breath and signaled retreat, but not before he promised, "I'll hang you both for this choice soon." When the torches drifted off, Gideon shut the door and told Naley, "We'd dig at dawn together, no more waiting." Dawn came red and hard, and smoke still clung to the porch like a warning that wouldn't wash off. Gideon pried boards from the window just enough to let light in, then he knelt by the stove and pressed his palm to that dark patch again. The resin felt tacky and it held the wood like a secret with teeth. So he warmed a knife blade and worked the edge slow. Naley sat upright now, shoulders squared, blanket hanging off her like a war cloak, eyes fixed on every move Gideon made. Outside the yard stayed quiet, but quiet after. Fire is never peace, it's waiting. Gideon slid the blade under the seam, lifted, and the board refused, so he wedged a chisel and leaned his weight in. The plank groaned, then popped, and a sour smell rose up, old tar and damp earth, like buried truth finally breathing again. Naley whispered, "Hartwell hid it deep," and Gideon nodded because men hide proof, the way thieves hide stolen gold. They pulled 2 boards free, then 3, and a square hole opened under the stove's shadow just big enough for a man's arms. Gideon reached in, fingers brushing cold metal, and his heart thumped once heavy and certain. He dragged out a small iron box wrapped in oilcloth, and the weight told him this wasn't letters, it was a weapon. Naley leaned close and her breath caught because she knew what those papers could do to chiefs and judges alike. Gideon set the box on the table, and before he opened it, hoofbeats sounded far off, then closer, testing the road again. Naley's eyes went sharp and she said, "Fletcher won't stop," and Gideon answered, "Then we don't stay hidden." He lifted the iron box and said, "We ride to liberty. We put truth in daylight or we die in smoke here." Naley rose, swaying once, then steadying, and she said, "If you go, I go, because this started with my rope." Gideon grabbed his Winchester, slung a canteen, and looked at the gate beam where she'd hung, then spat in the dirt. He said nobody hangs here again, and he meant the cabin, the town, and the whole rotten deal behind it. Gideon saddled his mare, and Naley mounted behind him quietly. The iron box rode in his bag, heavy as sin. They followed the creek road, keeping low where cottonwoods leaned. By noon, Liberty showed white buildings baking under flat sky. Folks stared from porches, and Gideon stared right back. Slowly, Naley kept her hood up, but her size drew eyes. At the general store, talk died like a candle pinched. The clerk paled and whispered, "Crow's Gate never sells clean." Gideon set supplies down and asked for the marshal now. Fletcher Knox stepped in, silver hat, bright smile, colder today. He glanced at Naley, then at Gideon's bag, then laughed. He dropped coins again and offered 1,000 this time. Gideon said no, and the room held its breath tight. Fletcher leaned closer and said, "Judges already signed your death." Naley spoke soft and told Fletcher her tribe remembers faces. Fletcher sneered and promised soldiers would burn the cabin first. Gideon lifted the iron box and set it on counter. The store went silent, and even the flies seemed careful. Gideon said Hartwell left proof and he will show law. Fletcher reached for it and Gideon slapped his hand away. A deputy moved forward and Naley stepped between them calmly. Her shadow filled the door and the deputy stopped cold. Gideon asked for Sheriff Briggs but got Judge Crane instead. Crane entered smiling and the town straightened like scared cattle. He said that box is stolen and Gideon must surrender. Gideon answered, "Open it first in front of everyone here." Crane hesitated, and Fletcher's eyes flashed warning at him then. An old widow nodded and said truth belongs in sunlight. Crane ordered the deputy, and the deputy fetched a key. Gideon opened the lid, and papers smelled of damp ink. Seals lay inside, and signatures matched men sitting in pews. Naley pointed at one name and said, "Webb stole land." Murmurs rose, and Crane's smile tightened like a rope loop. Fletcher barked at Harlan and told him to seize Gideon. Harlan grabbed Gideon's arm, and Gideon did not flinch once. Naley said, "Touch him again, and I break your wrist." Crane shouted about order, and Fletcher shouted about profit, too. Gideon raised a paper and read numbers out loud today. Those numbers named bribes, and half the crowd turned pale. A preacher stepped back and crossed himself without saying a word. Crane tried to leave, but two ranchers blocked the door. Fletcher drew his pistol, and Gideon leveled the Winchester steady. No shot fired because the town finally looked at itself. A bell rang outside, and a territorial marshal rode in. He saw the papers, and his face went as stone. Crane stammered excuses, and the marshal snapped irons on him. Harlan backed away, and Gideon said he will testify straight. Fletcher lunged for Naley, but she caught his wrist fast. She twisted once, and Fletcher dropped his gun with a yelp. The marshal ordered him down, and deputies dragged him outside. Gideon breathed deep, and Naley stood tall beside him, quiet. Liberty woke at last, and that cabin stopped whispering today. The marshal marched Crane out, and Liberty finally heard the truth without whiskey filters today. Fletcher sat in irons too, still smiling like he could bribe the sun itself tomorrow. Gideon signed a statement slow and steady, and Naley watched his hand never shake once. Folks who pitied him yesterday now avoided his eyes, afraid their silence might be counted. The clerk brought water, and Naley drank because freedom still needs a throat kept alive. Outside the store, men argued, but nobody dared call her property while the marshal listened. Gideon asked for witnesses, and two ranchers stepped forward tired of paying bribes in secret. A widow named Mrs. Parker offered Hartwell's letters proving he warned the town years ago. The marshal sealed the evidence and told Gideon to ride back before trouble regrouped again. Naley stepped into daylight hood down, and the crowd saw bruises they pretended not to. Gideon didn't boast, he just tipped his hat and led her to the horses quietly. They rode out with the marshal behind them, and Liberty's courthouse looked smaller in dust. Back at Crow's Gate, the beam still held a dark stain that wouldn't fade ever. Gideon scrubbed it hard, then nailed a fresh board over it like a promise made. Naley found a small carving under the stove, Hartwell's mark pointing at the hidden square. Gideon laughed once low and surprised and said, "That man was stubborn as me too." They patched the roof where torches burned, and Naley carried shingles like they were feathers. Gideon tried to lift beside her, and she shook her head, smiling for first time. That evening he cooked beans, and she ate slow, learning a meal could be safe. Naley asked what he wanted now, and Gideon answered, "Peace, if peace will stay here." She looked toward the trees, then said, "My people will come once they know truth." Gideon nodded and said land was open, but nobody would be treated like a sign. Days later, White Hawk's riders arrived, not to fight, but to escort Naley home safely. Naley stood between two worlds, and Gideon waited because choice must breathe on its own. She told her grandfather, "I was hung here, and this man cut me down alive." White Hawk studied Gideon, then placed a hand on his shoulder. Heavy with respect today, he said in English, "You guarded her honor, so our drums will remember your name." Naley didn't leave that morning. She stayed by Gideon's porch, eyes steady, heart decided already. Gideon asked why, and she said, "Home is where nobody sells your breath for coin." He swallowed hard, then said, I ain't rich, but I can give you honest days." She reached for his hand, careful and firm, and Gideon felt the cabin finally warm. They nailed a sign on the gate, one word burned deep: freedom for every passerby. Liberty kept talking, but the talk changed because men feared paper truth more than bullets. Gideon sent copies to the territorial marshal, so the evidence couldn't vanish in flames again. Nayli practiced English each night, and Gideon listened smiling when her words turned sharp true. "One sunset she asked you, 'Friend, would you pay 12 cents for trouble and stay?' Gideon answered for himself, saying, 'I'd pay my life if it saved one more soul.'" The wind moved through the grass, and the old cabin stopped feeling like a trap. It became a lantern for the lost, lit by two stubborn hearts that refused cruelty. And that is the West I trust, where mercy stands up and truth rides out.